Second Story Books, and this is our inaugural presentation in conjunction with the Historic Society of Washington. Hi. You can't hear? Okay, can you hear now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thanks. So, as I just said, this is our inaugural presentation with the Historic Society of Washington. We are intending to, on a periodic basis, give readings and lectures relating to the history of Washington. Our responsibility tonight is basically to hand this over to Jane Levy, who will introduce our speaker for the evening. But before that, I just want to encourage people to, if you're interested, we sell for the Historic Society their de-acquisition books from their library so they can get additional money to buy more books. So in case 9 3/4, we have books that are owned by the Historic Society. Any book purchased tonight, we are offering a 30% discount. All the money goes to the Historic Society. And in the way back, we have HSW journals, which same situation, 30% off the retail price. Tom is also going to be signing his book tonight. All the proceeds of those books will go to HSW also, so we encourage you to support the local Historical Society. Well, having said that, I'm going to introduce Jane Levy, the head archivist, and I believe in charge of the journals, correct? You are the publishing? Okay. Here's Jane.
All right. Am I close enough to the microphone that you can actually hear me? No. How about now?
Does it feel like it's on?
Is it on? Karen, can you hear me?
What? It could be better.
Don't be a wise guy. I can hear me, so you can hear me. Good evening, everybody. It's so nice to see you here. On behalf of the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., we need to thank Alan and Kim Stipek and the staff for the fabulous job they are doing as our partners in getting D.C. history into your hands and into the hands of everybody in the city. I am the chief historian for the Historical Society. I'm also managing editor of Washington History Magazine, which is our semi-annual magazine that publishes scholarship and fun things, actually, about D.C. history twice a year. As Alan said, our back issues are here in the store if you want to take a look. And if you join the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., you will get that as a benefit of membership twice a year. All right, I'm not going to spend any more time on the Historical Society because that's not why you came here. I am here also with the great privilege of introducing tonight's speaker. Tom Lupke has been Secretary of the Commission of Fine Arts since 2005, and that means that he's actually the Executive Director. It's a very old school title, right? But he's running the show. He is a very important and powerful personage, as I'm sure most of you know, but if you didn't know that coming in, you will understand that as you leave. A very, very knowledgeable person about federal design, and in fact the Commission of Fine Arts is one of the federal design review agencies here in the city that controls how our city progresses and how it looks, and what we keep and what we let go of. Fair enough? Okay. The design review. What about NCPC? Okay. The design review agency in the city. Tom is an architect. He has experience in city planning and deep experience in historic preservation. It's a very long biography, which thankfully I will not repeat here, but some highlights. He was the city architect for Alexandria, Virginia, and he is the member from the Commission of Fine Arts on the National Capital Memorials Advisory Commission, another job that takes brave people to do. Right? Yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, last week's meeting. Okay, so he has been a frequent speaker on architecture and design in Washington. Before he became such an expert, he had a great education, including a couple places you may have heard of, including the Harvard School of Design, and he was at the American Academy in Rome. He is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. A previous book is called Civic Art, a centennial history of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, which he gets credit for, but tells me he didn't really do all by himself. Pretty much, okay. And the other major thing I want to point out about what he does in his work day, he was the instigator of the Monumental Core Framework Plan that was developed in 2009 for the City of Washington. So we are really in for a treat. Tom Lukey is going to talk to us about his new book, Palace of State, the Eisenhower Office Building. Please welcome Tom Lukey.
Get this teed up. Hello, good evening. It's kind of a big crowd for the space, but I'm thrilled everybody's interested. With that, I'm just going to launch right into it. We're going to go over this material, and you can't hear? All right.
Thank you.
Oh, right in there.
Is that working?
Yes.
All right. You probably, okay, I'm going to try to do this again. Now, what I was going to say, that's a very nice introduction. Thank you. It's great to be here. Big crowd. I'm going to just kind of start giving the talk, and there'll be some Q&A afterwards, I'm hoping, if there's time. This is a story about a building to risk personification has had came into the world kind of up, and then it kind of went down, and then we've seen some recent sort of rehabilitation of the reputation. So it's got a sort of an interesting narrative arc, but it goes back to the Gilded Age, which was an interesting period in Washington history. It's really the time when the city first really came into its own as a kind of a place that was very attractive to people suddenly. It had always been problematic in the early and mid-19th century. Finally, in that after the Civil War, the city really blossomed. So this is maybe one of the most exemplary buildings of that era. I'll just start with a little eye candy. Is that moving?
Yes, it is.
How do I? No, it's not showing.
No, you can do it on the thing. Yeah. I'm still try out.
Okay, I'm just.
What next slide?
Oh, I see. It may.
I got you.
It's not seeing anything.
Keep it on there.
Keep it.
Yeah.
Keep it.
Right.
There we go.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, this is going to be. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, part of this book is actually extremely. It's all about the visuals. It's actually highly curated. We got about 1,000+ images from the General Services Administration, and this is really the what was the background of this. Where's the update again? We're going to get there. It's going to be better.
Perfect.
Nope.
You're clicking the wrong mouse button.
Should be clicking the middle.
No, the one over there.
That one.
Yeah.
That's why. Okay. These buildings just got incredible detail, design elements. When's the last time you saw a skylight like that? Amazing Victorian interiors. Yeah. Majestic staircases.
Been a couple of years since I've been seeing it.
So this sort of illustrates that narrative arc. At the time, one of the writers, when it was finished in the 1880s, one of the writers said, it's altogether one of the finest buildings in the world. If not the world, this was a centennial history of the city of Washington, 1892. 35 years later, 40 years later, the Commission of Fine Arts chairman, Charles Moore, who had been really instrumental in he's on the Macmillan Commission and then became part of the Commission of Fine Arts. He said that the State War Navy building's pseudo-classicism employed hundreds of stunted columns, a multitude of pediments, projections everywhere, and a roof that the camel's humps would put to shame, all done in the name of classical art. Simplicity, proportion, dignity, and beauty, these fundamental principles of classical architecture went by the board. So there's definitely a downward slide in the arc here. So another 20 years passes, and then President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who said, well, this is a ringing endorsement. I worked 9 years in this building, and so from sentiment's sake, I'd probably say I don't want it torn down. So, and then we go into the, really getting into the late 20th century, where there's a much bigger interest in, in historic architectural forms and sort of the waning of the primacy of modernism. We have Henry Russell Hitchcock, a tremendously important architectural historian, says that it is perhaps the best extant example of, in America, the Second Empire. The complex massing of the mansards, especially the center, and the dignified restraint of the detailing are unequaled. So there really is this kind of arc that goes across. And I'm going to go right back to get to my little target here. There we go. So, like everything, you can't have a lecture without talking about the L'Enfant plan. I'm sorry. The fundamental thing about, it's always worth mentioning that Washington it's so interesting because it literally was established as a symbolic city. It is sort of the idea of this political experiment, and the Constitution turned into a city plan. It takes all the elements of nature, which is the topography, of culture and human life, which is the grid, and then it overlays this special relationship with the public spaces, the commemorative avenues, and then finally the most important monuments and seats of government. So it's a kind of interesting build-up. It's a little bit unique in the world in the way it does it. If you look at the grid, it ends up being a little bit irrational. Everything, surprise. But it's amazing that it has lasted and that it was actually built out. It took so long to do. The roots, of course, of this democratic experiment come out of classical philosophy and antiquity. And this, of course, is the time. This is out of the late 18th century. There was tremendous new interest in antiquity and these ideals. And, of course, the architecture came with it. The original buildings of this is the Capitol in about, what does it say? I think this engraving is from the 1840s, but it's basically in that early 19th century style with a low dome that was put on it. But there was basically a very sober classical revival it was internationally the style in the West. And of course, the design for the White House itself, which is really almost coming out of the 18th century. It's really a Georgian derivative design, but again, mostly classical. Another one is the Old City Hall by George Hatfield. This is still standing, although it was reclad in the 30s and added onto, and it doesn't have a dome like that anymore. But this was the kind of of course, everybody knows this is the sort of the style. I love this image of Washington. This is from Anacostia, looking over past the Navy Yard. Is it better? Sorry. Back to the city, and what's interesting is that it is a very low brick city, kind of messy. There's just a few public buildings that stand out. Those white buildings, you can see the Capitol, the White House way over in kind of the middle, to the right, and then to the left, and in the foreground is the Navy Yard. So there's not that much. It doesn't really start to come up until the 1830s. Surrounding the White House is where they put the executive departments. There were 4 executive departments established by the Constitution: State, War, Navy, and Treasury. And they eventually all got their own little boxy buildings on the 4 corners of the White House, where the Treasury and this building are today. But that's all there were. They were designed by, for those architecture junkies, they were Hatfield buildings that were burned in 1813, and then they were sort of rebuilt by Hoban. So the later English architect built the first ones, and then they were redesigned and built by the one who came here later. Here's a picture of a little watercolor from the French ambassador's wife. Oops, not too fast. 1830 or something. So moving forward up to the mid-19th century, the Treasury Department, which is the people who are collecting all the money to make it all work, of course, they get their first. They're the ones who really get the first go at enlargement. So they basically take the entire east side of the White House area. This becomes the Treasury Department, and you can see the old State Department there in the foreground. So the State Department people have to move out while they build the Treasury, and they move into something called the asylum, the orphans asylum building, which is like 14th and S or something like that. It doesn't stand today, but Treasury gets completed. And there it is. This is a little bit later view of it, but you can see this is a promulgation. It's still coming out of that. This is it's designed by Robert Mills in the 1830s, completed later by around 1869, partially by the same architect who did our building, A.B. Mullen. But I'm just sort of establishing this as the sort of the classical baseline that we're all familiar with in Washington. Then we get to the mid-19th century, and we have a couple of other trends coming in. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice, which is really great. There's the Gothic revival, or medievalizing styles. These are generally used for institutions that have a kind of a higher moral purpose, including the Smithsonian by James Renwick, the St. Elizabeth's Home for the Insane, and the D.C. jail. You know, it's this very intense moral idea. Of course, it goes without saying it goes with churches. So this is actually quite popular in the 1840s and into the 50s. The other big mid-century trend, there we go, is what we don't really think about here in Washington, but it's the Baroque revival. This is actually a really big deal in a larger arc of architectural history. It's basically taking, the Renaissance moves into Baroque styles, which is a much more loose, fluid composition of classical elements, and so they do the same thing in the West in the mid-19th century. And the Capitol Dome is, of course, our very best example of that. This is Thomas Hugh Walter's. It's a kind of a copy of a copy of a copy, but it goes back to St. Paul's, which is a 17th century thing, going back to Michelangelo and the dome of St. Peter's. So the design spirit of the Baroque is really, when we talk about the Second Empire style in France, it's really part of that trend. Famous engraving, Currier and Ives, Washington, D.C. You can see the city starting to develop here with the Capitol, Pennsylvania Avenue in between, and then you're starting to get these larger buildings. But by the 1840s, they were trying to come up with a place to accommodate these kind of burgeoning government activities. And so the idea was to get the Treasury on the east side that we're going to do, and then we'll just put all state, war, and Navy all in one nice building on the other side. And so this is a plan from the 1840s that says, well, why don't we just double the whole scheme and put them in there, and there's kind of this figure-8 building, which is essentially what they kind of argue about, and this is planned out in literally 30 years before they start building it. Now, let me just talk a little bit about that French Empire style. This is the Louvre in the 1740s. You can see the main. Are you guys getting that cursor on? No. This is the pavilion, the main pavilion of the horloge, or the clock. You can see it's a little bit of a jumble of stuff. But what happens is over the centuries, it becomes kind of architecturalized in a more emphatic way, and it rolls into existence in a very monumental way. This is the same building, right? I mean, there's the same, or at least the same fragment of a building here. It's been highly regularized. This is the mid-century in Paris. This is the French Empire era of Napoleon III, La Fouille. They take this building, of course they repeat these pavilions over and over again. It's very stunning. I think you remember about the French political. While they had sort of taken a beating at the turn of the 19th century, Trafalgar, etc., they had tremendous cultural power. Think about everything that was going on in the 19th century in terms of painting, theater, music, art, food, shopping, clothes, everything. The idea of French is sort of associated with the softer side of things, and it has tremendous cultural appeal. and it makes its way everywhere. So here's Napoleon III and the Empress at an evening fete in 1867, I think. You can see the sort of the glamour of this was really impressive. In a way that there was much more glamour in Paris than there would have been with Queen Victoria, for example. That this is the pavilion, that central piece that we showed, and how and I just want to look at this a little bit carefully about the arches, the build-up, the pediment, and the dome, the mansard. And there's the Boston City Hall of 1857. It's kind of a little rip-off. Now, everybody who studies architectural history knows that it's always a little bit of a rip-off. So, but it's interesting how these ideas propagate. And so you're sort of leaping from a palace, a palace that's a residence. That's really what the word palace means. It's like where the king or the emperor lives. This is now in Boston. This is seen as the appropriate new style for government. Well, the British also think this is a kind of a cool idea, and they have this huge competition in 1857 for their version of the State Department, which is called the Foreign Office. And out of the 7 finalist winners, like 5 of them are somehow in this new French style. This is one. I think this is the winning one. And the style actually propagates all over the world in some way. So one of the ideas here is that this French Empire thing is not just an American phenomenon. It goes everywhere. I don't know if you can read that, but we've got Canada, Vienna, Brisbane, Australia. I love that with the little palm trees in the background. And then the most wild thing is Calcutta down there, which is a kind of an Oriental fantasy of the same. So they take these same elements and they just compose them. So taking our story back to the United States, the architect who does this building is Alfred B. Mullett, who is at that point the supervising architect of the Treasury. He's actually English-born but raised in Ohio. He does his little apprenticeship and ends up here in D.C. in the 1860s after the war. Eventually takes over, actually sort of boots his old boss out of the way, gets in charge, and he is in charge of, as supervising architect of the Treasury, then this is this burgeoning time. The war is over, we're trying to reassert federal influence, and it's all about all these activities that the federal government is involved in. Post offices, courthouses, custom houses. It's all about enforcing the law and bringing in the money, really, all over the country. So there's this huge program that goes. It starts in the 1850s, and a lot of you probably are aware of some of those buildings. They're all over the place: Galveston, Portland, and Portland. All sorts of places in the country. But it's a huge program. The other important part of this story is General Grant, who becomes president in 1869, and there's this just sort of leap into the Gilded Age at this point. There's a tremendous upsurge in economic activity. It's important to remember that how much the United States mushroomed between the Civil War and the turn of the 20th century. Things like steel production, iron, all this stuff goes up by about tenfold. It goes from being a provincial power over there across the ocean and becomes the equal and then surpasses British and French and German production in that 35-year period. So it's kind of intense. There's lots to say about the Grant administration, but needless to say, they weren't that concerned about the morality that you might have seen in the Gothic Revival buildings, but they liked the sumptuousness of that French style. I mean, it's all part of the same era. This is Mullett's design for the New York post office, which this was torn down in the 30s. But it sort of shows all those same elements. It comes right out of that French tradition. But these are very big buildings. They built one of these in the 6 or 7 of the largest American cities at that time. New York, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Boston. Well, Boston had its own, the Boston Post Office, Washington. There's something similar in Cincinnati, and New Orleans is the one that isn't quite in this style. But you can, I don't know if you can read them, but Anyway, it's a kind of a typology that emerges in this very narrow period, 1869 to 75. Now, the other thread, these are huge government office buildings, which is a little bit of a new thing in this country, right? The Treasury is the first one, and this is basically the Treasury just being replicated in these big blocks. They are essentially little cells of space, boom, 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 organized around courtyards and stairwells, and that's it. So it's always, this is the interesting thing about the Baroque revival, is that it's kind of hard to do a huge box in classicism and make it not look funny. Now, you may have your opinions, but the interesting thing about the Baroque was that they could put all sorts of clothes on the dummy. And so that's part of why I think it had such appeal. The other side of it was this softer side, I'll call it, the French side, the cultural side. This is our own Renwick building, also correct. You can see it's all coming out in the late 50s and 60s. This was designed, Corcoran went to Paris, saw this stuff, got Renwick to copy books, or I don't know what. But what's interesting about the side of it, is that it's very, it really comes out of urban palace designs. So it's sort of like, it's more like, well, there's a big room behind this big pavilion, and then there's a stair behind it. You can sort of read the building in these moves. It's not necessarily the case in these big office buildings. I sort of see that there's two kinds of, and one is a little bit more of that government British style. This is more of the French style. And the French style has its appeal also. You see it being perpetuated all the way through. Now, this is San Francisco on the left, the hotel, what's the name of it? The Baldwin, in Sin City on the bay. This is, late 19th century. And then, of course, the Gilsey House in Manhattan. This is also like one of these first kind of warehouse turning into department store typology. So it's all about consumption, opulence, bourgeois. It's this whole new trend, really, that's happening in the West. So, let's talk about the design of the building, per se. I sort of said this is a case of putting clothes on the dummy. You can see this is I forget, is it 700 feet long? It's tremendous amount of how do you turn that into something plausible as a building that doesn't just overwhelm. So he breaks it down into these little pavilions, etc. People probably are pretty familiar with the elevations, but you can see how closely it derives from those forms. There it is. And it really works best on these diagonals, where you can sort of see the pushing and pulling of those pavilions and forms, and then there's like little bits of sculpture here and there that really kind of bring it to life. But look at the plan. It's dead regular. Boom. It's a figure 8. Stairs in the 8 corners, around 2 courtyards, and then all the fun stuff is happening around these edges. And again, I think there's a really strong connection to these warehouse designs. That, Mullet had worked in this office of Isaiah Rogers, who was one of the first hotel designers in the country. Now, it wasn't John Portman in the 60s or 70s. This is actually when the typology of the urban hotel emerged, and it was so this is the famous Maxwell House, as in the coffee. In Nashville, you can see that it's sort of the same thing. You're taking little cells of space and trying to dress it up, and this is the same that warehouse kind of idea from Soho, the Howard building. It's informed by Renaissance architecture, but you can see it's struggling to try to make something more out of it. So you can see that kind of background, and you can see with this new stuff, they're trying to sort of make it more and more 3D. I love this picture because you sort of see that grid kind of pushing forward. But look at that section. All the fun stuff is on the outside, and the inside looks like a prison yard. I mean, it's just so incredibly utilitarian. There are moments in the building where it really sings. You have these incredible staircases in the 8 staircases, and they're topped always with a skylight. And look at those amazing curling things that go up the full height of the building from, the basement all the way up to the 5th floor. In some cases, it's, 100 and something feet. There's detail, especially at the roofs, pediments, little spots where they pull in the iconography, but it's not super lush the way that those French, like the Louvre is just encrusted. This is actually, and each one of these pavilions was done with iconography appropriate to the department that it was in. It was the State Department had stars, the Navy would have, anchors and fish and, things like that, and war would have oak leaves. And so it was actually very intentional. Couple of little issues about this. These are, there are these beautiful, unbelievable drawings in the archives that are huge linen drawings that are rendered ink and then rendered with watercolors and stuff. And this is an example that shows this whole idea of framing the roof with iron and then covering it in all the glass and everything. So it was actually technologically fairly innovative in a number of ways. I'll just quickly, it's interesting from that technological point of view. These were all built to be fireproof. This was a huge problem in the 19th century. In the 1860s, the patent office burned, which was disastrous for that whole scientific record. They were very concerned about it. The whole design of the building was intended to be fireproof. All the walls are masonry. You can see in this drawing, it's kind of a little hard to tell, but all the ceilings is sort of typical of that time, cast iron beams and then arched in parallel rows, brick arches, and then filled up top with concrete. So the whole thing is designed to withstand really terrible things that would have happened. Now, there are a lot of other technological innovations, are things that are informed by technology, principal among which is actually the stone cutting capacity in the United States that develops in the 1850s. The old style buildings were all built out of softer stone. The White House and Capitol are sandstone, which you can practically cut with a fingernail file. A limestone is hard to come by and harder, but it's brittle and it's not so durable. Granite is great, but it's a bear to cut, and so people didn't really use it because they used it for curves and stuff. But if you had to chisel it out, you could never use it in quantity. So one of the great inventions or innovations of that era was to mechanize. Part of this industrial revolution was to mechanize stone production, and it's really based. A lot of it's based in Maine, but also nearby other places nearby. You get big stone quarries, but there are lots of patents and stuff. And this building is unimaginable without the application of powered stone cutting. So it's a huge part of how they could get that size. The other thing, this is the first building that's done, as far as we know, for the federal government with dedicated elevators. The Otis elevator, safety passenger elevator, I think it's patented in the late 1860s. There's all sorts of interesting passive ventilation systems through the walls. Does anybody want to know who the plumber was for the building? A guy named Alexander Wilby Shepard. You know that name? Boss Shepard was the plumbing contractor. That's how he kind of got big, from contracts like this. The story of the construction is a long one. I'm not going to go into much about, the personalities, but I just want to mention a couple of other characters in this piece. There was a kind of a falling out after they finished the State Department, or before actually they even finished the first wing. It was built in phases, 4 major campaigns, and even before the end of the first one, they started bailing out. So eventually, it was taken over by Thomas Lincoln Casey, who was this guy, the larger, and he's the engineer who brought us. He actually completed the Washington Monument. He was involved in a lot of these civic projects. So he was the one who kind of came in and took control and got it built, even though it took 16 and a half years. The other guy is up here is a guy named Richard von Etzdorf, who was he was from Vienna, and he had a design training there, and then he came over as a 25-year-old, got hired by A.D. Mullet at the Treasury, and worked on this project. And he actually worked on it for years. And a lot of the designs that get developed on the interiors are actually coming from him. Now, he's a very young man when he comes in, and he goes into his practice and does great. He basically takes over. The idea of the building and all the major pieces are all set by A.B. Mullet, but then Van Etzdorf works under him and then pretty much takes over on these other design things generally. That's just a picture of the drafting office for this project in the 1870s. So construction starts. They have to clear out the old White House stables. You know, it's a huge. You know, they're doing this a lot of this by hand. That's the south wing coming up. This is now the early 1870s. You see the cranes that they're using to hoist it all into place. There it is, late 1874. It's all by itself, right? You know, it's just like this little thing. So then the next, by this time, this is when the crisis is happening, and Mullet quits or is told to quit, and that's how it works here. By the way, you're told to quit. This is the east side of the building coming up. You can sort of see the east side, and then you can see 17th Street in the background. But you can look at that wild construction. Do you see those humpy things in the foreground? Those are the tops of those brick arches that are the ceilings. They haven't been, and they're going to come back in with rubble and concrete to level it out. There it is on the west side. So, take a deep breath. They finish it in 1888, and it really is a spectacular facility. It's got amazing, sumptuous interiors like that are really not like anything maybe in the Capitol is about it. But this is, again, these are the only, by this time there are, I think there are 6, they've added interior and agriculture in the mid-19th century, but this is otherwise. This seat of the executive branch, and it's also a place for entertaining all these foreign dignitaries and people who visit, so it's very sumptuous. This is the State Department reception room. Now, I'm using the historic photographs to establish the record of it at the time, black and white. But I will show better pictures of the restoration. But it's pretty sumptuous. It's got multicolored, geometric stenciling, carpeting, wild stuff, custom designed gasoliers with curling. It's extremely fancy. Here is every department. There are 3 departments that go in here, and each one of them gets a kind of a major executive kind of suite with a reception room, and then a secretary's office, and then there's a library somewhere, and then there's associated domes and stuff. So this is the first one that gets built, which is the State Department library. Multiple tiers around a central thing with a skylight. They are squeezing this poor thing into the plan. Sorry, I should have shown it on the plan, but it's. Remember I was talking about like that articulation of space and being able to see it. This is one of the they're like, oh, we got this grid. We'll have to push it in here into the side that they have to make the corridor has to jog a little bit to squeeze it in. But it's interesting. In my research, I discovered that this was actually considered at the time, mid-1870s, it became a model of library design. When the Peabody people were trying to plan their library, they came here to visit, and I came here to visit, and I found it in their minutes, the board minutes. And the reason why I knew this is because, sorry, I just skipped ahead. The reason why I knew this is because I saw a beautiful photograph of the Peabody. I'm like, wait a minute, that looks so familiar. It looks just like the State Department. I realized, I was like, well, there must be a relationship. And it turns out that this was the model for the other. This is the this is the Navy Secretary's office. It is probably the most over the top of all. Huge. This room is like 100 feet long and 30 feet wide, and has inlaid, amazing 3 or 4 woods inlaid in this kind of hexagonal pattern, and amazing scroll work on the stencil. It's been restored, so we'll see better pictures of it. And somebody mentioned this name. This is known as the Indian Treaty Room. It was built as the Navy Department reception room and library. So, you just go there and check out your book. I don't know, they had these little alcoves where they kept their books. I think they probably didn't worry about it so much. But it's really intended to impress. This is that sensibility of this kind of right after the Civil War, this sort of incipient Gilded Age. It's really about making a big splash, and that Baroque style really conveys that spirit. A couple interesting people who were here, both of whom were named Roosevelt, both of who served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Theodore on the left in the, it would have been the Harrison administration, and then Franklin shown there with Josephus Daniels in the teens during World War I, and when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Both of them had offices in the building. And finally, this is the War Department suite, and you see William Howard Taft, who was there in the early 1900s, just before he, 1905 to 9. Finally, the other really interesting space is the War Department library, which is actually way up on the 5th floor, which is kind of, it's not even a full floor, it's sort of under the roof. This is perhaps the most stylistically innovative space in the whole building. It's done in a very, by this time this is the mid-1880s when they're building it. We're now like 20, maybe 25 years after this French Empire thing comes in. So we kind of moved on. This is a great example of this eclectic style which pulls together. You can see these kind of arches. It's all open work in 3 different tones of dark metal, sort of coppery dark metal and dark metal and golden dark metal. It's sort of filigree. It's done in a sort of little bits of Gothic. It's very beautiful, and it was allowed to kind of be messed up. But the building sort of goes into the 20th century, and it is really a focus of a lot of activity. You know, the diplomatic world revolves around it. It was also the place. This shows, if you can see this little dot here, that's the time ball. Does anybody know what the time ball was for?
For years?
No, but it's the same idea. Okay, so this is before standard time zones. At the Naval Observatory, when it hit solar noon, they would telegraph the signal, and then the ball would drop, and you'd go and you'd set your pocket watch to noon, which was different in every place. Another thing that relates to time and chronography is that they actually convened an international conference on, what was it called, the International Meridian Conference. They set this up it was held in Washington in 1888 in this building to figure out, literally, the modern system of coordinates with setting Greenwich as 0, and so that you could actually then regularize the sense of timing. So like with train schedules, when it's, if you just go with solar noon, it's actually not noon here when it says noon on the clock. It's actually, in summertime, it's actually 1:07 or something like that. So anyway, everybody had their own local time. This is kind of an idea about standardizing it. Sorry, I don't know how we got so far out. But, other weird stuff happened. This is an exposition, biplane flyer landing on East Executive Avenue. This is the West Wing on one side of the building. This was in 1915, I think. Now, let's move into the 20th century, or at least we're going to start with something that a trend that really changes everything, and that is the classical revival, the City Beautiful movement. A different idea about sort of a recalling to earlier roots in terms of style. It really takes off in America, and the real source, perhaps, is the Chicago Fair. It's 1892 to 4. Hard to overestimate its importance in American cultural history, at least in architecture, because it conveys a brand new, kind of amazing, consolidated idea. I'm going to go back to this idea. America has gone from this provincial place to a world leader. It has just eaten the Spanish overseas empire. There's just like this tremendous, we were inventing light bulbs and movie cameras and, it's a really amazing time. This is sort of this idea, I think, of finding an expression that aligns with that sense of possibility and destiny. There's always, with American culture history, you always got to look maybe for religious underpinning. There's the manifest destiny question. There's the exceptionalism question. Even Daniel Burnham himself, who was the organizer of this fair, he was raised by a Swedenborgian, and the Swedenborgian religion is keyed on bringing an idea of heaven to earth. And I think that may have informed this idea for the fair. It's literally this glittering, white, unbelievable, coordinated environment that nobody has ever seen, at least in this country. It may be the first time most people were seeing electric lights, or at least used in a consolidated way. Something like, I don't remember, some of you may know this, either a third or a half of the American population traveled to Chicago over those 2 years and saw this thing. Kind of hard to imagine how significant it was, and it formed our sort of cultural patterning of what was appropriate civic architecture for 40 or 50 years. Even in Washington, modernism came, but it actually only dented this idea. It didn't actually overwhelm it. The Macmillan plan for Washington is a direct outgrowth. They actually invited Burnham to come back and actually implement that idea on a grand scale for D.C. Again, trying to turn Washington into a capital city of such of such beauty and grandeur that it was commensurate with this new status in the world. So the OEOB, it was nice, but it's kind of fussy. And we need to go back to that big grand thing. So there was by the 20th century, we're starting to get like, we need to get rid of all that stuff. So this is John Russell Pope's idea. You can see the outline in the background that's the old executive office building, the big ornate building with all its crenellations and turrets, and gone away. We're turning it into sort of a twin of the Treasury Department. Here's another one by Waddy Wood. Same idea, ionic order. You got on the right side, you have the old, outward the old, on the left is the new. So they try to work with the windows. But you can imagine trying to redo that building that's all granite. I remember I said how hard it was to work. But this era, by the mid-20s, late 20s, it's really this is the downfall of all that Victorian stuff. They start to tear it down. This is a picture of that beautiful New York post office and courthouse being demolished. There's a hilarious title of that statue, which is called "Virtue Victorious Over Vice" or something like. Of course, it's a man with his neck on a woman's, his foot stomping a woman's neck. But anyways, it's sort of this. There's kind of a moral idea also of modernism, the clean lines and the sort of industrial aesthetic actually scrubbing away that old. Now, this building, Washington this is at a time when the federal government is actually starting to really take off in the 20s, 30s, and into, of course, the World War II era. So the buildings just get crammed bigger and bigger and bigger, and they start to, cram people in, and they're starting to put, file clerks in the domes and stuff. This goes on. The Navy Department just really moves out mostly during World War I. The War Department moves out mostly in 1938. So really by the 40s, it's just really the State Department and some other, and it's full, it's brimmed. This shows that stylistic change from the 1890s to probably the 30s. You can see it's the same room, same view, same everything, except everything they painted out all this gold stenciling. It's all been kind of erased. Now, during the war, they did all sorts of other things. The building had been decorated with trophy cannon from the Spanish-American War, and here they are taking it out. They're going to melt it down into, cannon, and then this is one of those beautiful skylights in the middle, on the right, which has been painted out. That was actually an anti-bombing thing, because they every single skylight that was in, they were all stained glass. 6 or 8 major ones, they were all removed or either covered up or removed. This is that story. This was built to be the War Department in the late 30s. Quickly becomes too small because of the World War II. They actually built the Pentagon within 5 years, and eventually this building becomes what is now the State Department. So they move. So everybody who was ever in this building by 1948 has moved out. Where's the Pentagon? Just a little scale comparison. So by the So the late 40s, early 50s, this building really becomes all the office of the president. It's all the executive branch, which used to be, at the time of Lincoln, it was one or two secretaries. In the 20s, I think it was probably, could be counted in the teens, in the dozens. And then it grows, and by the 50s, we're getting into the high hundreds, maybe 1,000 people. So this is this era. Of course, they have to do something. They do lots of studies because it's by this is like the nadir of the whole building's sort of reputation or how it's held popularly. Is it's considered just this really sad relic of the Victorian era. But it's too expensive to do anything about. They do all these studies. They propose tearing it down. They propose all these other things. But nothing ever quite happens. Meanwhile, it gets used. It starts to become like the place where they have the press office briefings. And so in the 50s and into the 60s, before they started doing it in the West Wing, these were always the place where they would do this is in the treaty room. You got Eisenhower on the right, and Truman, I think, is on the other side. There's Kennedy addressing a bunch of midgets, is what it looks like. It's just a camera angle. But there's the building in the background. So it becomes part of this White House campus. Just quickly, the preservation movement starts, as you probably know, in earnest really in the 60s. It's the Kennedy administration that says, you know what, I think we should actually invest in the building. They make the sort of key decisions in like 61 that they're not going to ever tear it down. They're going to I had to put in the pictures of the don't tear it down people, but of course the twist here is that it's now the Trump Hotel. Anyway,
it's really beautiful on the
it is a beautiful, that project, just to plug the preservation law that we have, was protected through the Tax Act, and they had to follow very strict preservation guidelines, and it's an amazing way to get private enterprise to invest in these public assets. So anyway, on the right, Jackie Kennedy was very interested in this stuff and famously helped redevelop that whole, the Jackson Square area. So it's always been this kind of presidential place. This is actually Johnson coming to meet this is literally the day they landed from Dallas after the assassination. We have Nixon and Kissinger and his dog. What is her name? Oh gosh. Anyway, the pool is on the floor there, and this was his hideaway office in the building. But you can see, look at those interiors. They're just very, very stripped. So by the 80s, this place had been so degraded. You have all these ghastly, there are window air conditioners everywhere, like wiring, dropped ceilings. It's sort of unrecognizable on the inside. I just want you to look here. It's unfortunate you don't have the detail, but this little moment is a little cutaway. Sorry, that was not a good thing. It's a little classical colonnade in dark bronze with gold and copper highlights. Does that remind you of anything? It's actually that room because they didn't really like the decor, and so they just covered it up with gold drapery and dropped in the ceiling. And this is how this was, 1980. So interestingly, it's actually in the 80s that the building starts to become rehabilitated. Starts under actually the Reagan administration and then the George W. Bush. They start to actually undertake some initial work to redo some of the key spaces. So here you have George Bush in that sumptuous Navy suite where they're going to actually put it all back. There it is. This is a contemporary photograph from the late 80s where they just restored it for the first time. It happens a couple times. The domes are restored. Now, in a lot of cases, this skylight, the red, white, and blue one over on the east side was already there. They said take the paint off and then repaint everything else. So this was like part of the mid 80s work. Here was another story. This is the west. So I should know that I was actually part of this. Briefly, it was my first job out of college, and I was a research assistant working on the restoration work. And one of my jobs was to go to the archives and find construction records, and I found this interesting drawing that showed a kind of a pie-shaped wedge with these interesting kind of curlicue patterns, and it had little numbers, like a little key code. And I realized it was actually a coded plan in this kind of Tiffany style for this, because we didn't know what it looked like. The frustrating thing is that we had the key, but we didn't have the colors they were keyed to. So we knew that this squiggle was number 3, and that bar was number 4, but we didn't know whether it was blue, white, pink. They hired people who knew about this stuff, so this is a conjectural reconstruction. The pattern is correct, but nobody knows whether the colors are exactly right. So, finally, it takes us up to our current century. In a sad way, it all gets started. It's really about 9/11. This is a crisis time. Oh, by the way, on the left is George Bush dedicating the building. It's renamed as the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. It gets a little confusing for people because you're like, well, Eisenhower, what's that about? Because you expect some big blocky thing. But anyway. So that's why it's called that. But, the middle shows like a blood drive, literally on September 12th. It had a huge impact on obviously in so many ways. I don't want to talk about every way, but just in terms of the physical design and investment in government assets. There was, over the next 15 years, there was a tremendous investment in the buildings, particularly when it came to building security. This building had never been comprehensively renovated. It was completed in the late 19th century, and by this time we're talking about 2001. So you had air conditioners. I sort of showed you the mess. So they actually decided it was time to do it, and the reason they could get away with it was to say we have to make the building safe from blasts. So they went through and they did all this stuff on the perimeters. You did wing by wing, shut down a whole part of the building. It took about 10 years to do, from about 2005 through 15. Part of the cool thing that the GSA was able to pull off was to actually get a little tiny bit of that funding, really, probably of 1%, to pay for the restoration of the really great spaces that were in it, the ones that you actually see. So while they were lifting up the floors and putting conduits and reinforcing the windows and all, replacing the bulletproof glass and reinforcing the structure and all this stuff, there was also work to actually bring back the significant parts of the building. So here you can see this is work on the outside, work on the inside. You can see they're laying cables all over the place, but they're also redoing their significant spaces. So this is totally comprehensive. And the result has really been a magnificent thing. They went to a historic paint analysis and brought back these sort of, wild, to our eye, probably Victorian colors. This is that State Department, State Department reception room. And I don't know if you can see, I'm a little off here, but you can see that incredibly lush stenciling that goes all over the place. Carving, that's a lion's head over the mantle. The State Department library was actually the last thing to complete. It was actually completed right at the end of 16. And unfortunately, it was so fresh, we didn't actually have time to get a good new photograph of it. So this is actually a photograph from the 80s. And then it was used for, actually, believe it or not, through the Obama initiatives in a locker room. And then they finally restored it. But it also has this much more muted palette of that more mid-19th century style. Beautiful, lush stuff. You can see the restoration. This is scrubbed. This is the ironwork that's been scrubbed down and then repainted and gilded. This is now the vice president's office. It had to be redone because there you go. It burned. You remember it burned? At the end of 2008, there was a big fire, and they had to, after they had redone it for George H.W. Bush, they had to come back and take it all apart and do it again. So the guys cleaning it all off. But see these amazing medallions and stuff. They have that floor. Treaty room had. This isn't quite fitting, but that's all right. It's not quite centered. It just shows, down there on the right, it's interesting, you can see, there's this little figurehead here. They found this in some other part of the building, reinstalled it, and then restored it. You can see, if you can barely see, she's all fixed up. And a lot of this was done, instead of actually painting on the surfaces, they did it off-site on canvas, and they put it on like wallpaper. You can't really tell, but it actually is a good way. And a normal preservation practice is to leave these panels. You can see like maybe a little bit of it. That's the original painting. That's left as a kind of a test panel to reveal what the original material was, and then they fill it in all around to match. There's that skylight that I was involved with the documentation of. And that I told you about that library and all that. I think it's a really beautiful space. These are oak leaves that are actually on plaster on these iron curved panels, and it would have been originally would have been lit by gas lights all the way around. Interesting iconography. Oops. I love this because it shows that people think it's a snake, but it's not. It's a salamander. And the salamander, it's for the War Department. The salamander, does anybody have any idea what the classical allusion is?
Salamanders are fireproof?
Fireproof invincibility. And the reason why is that people would put rotten logs on the fire and all the little amphibians would go crawling out, but the myth was that they actually lived on fire, that they were associated with fire. I'm losing my... Oh, there it is. Sorry. Just like 3 slides to go, and maybe make that 2. This shows how that War Department suite was renovated. This is what it was in the 1890s. This is what it was by the end of the early 21st century. It's completely stripped down, dropped ceiling, blah, 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 and then they brought it back. Including this amazing ceiling fresco, which has Mars and Victory and their chariots kind of coming across. You've seen stuff like this a little bit like those graffiti murals in the Capitol. It's that same kind of spirit. And the walls are kind of intense plaster medallions. Oops, and all that in a beautiful array. Now this is really one of the last ones showing the intense restoration work. This is the finished product, but this is the kind of the 1, 2, 3, 4. Taking it, this is what it was like. This is where they are filling it in, painting it over, and then finally doing all the highlighting. You can't. It's hard to see in this format, but in the book, it's pretty dramatic to see. Work on the exterior also. So that's it. This is a wonderful shot from some doughboy in 19. The building continues to live on in Washington life. Unfortunately, it's not as accessible, which is one of the reasons why we did the book, because it's hard to get into. It probably will always be hard to get into, but it's kind of an interesting part of the city's legacy. And I was thrilled to be able to do that, and happy to take any questions. I know we've got a little bit of time. Yeah.
How do you get a tour? Or is it just not?
There is not a public tour program. It generally works because getting into the White House complex, which is this is really part of, just requires an appointment. So if there's someone who is convening a meeting that you're part of, or that there's some sense, but there isn't at this point, as far as I know, any kind of major public tour program. I mean, people do go in there, but it's always kind of associated with they're having a group in for some reason or another.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that because I was there a couple of years ago as an intern, and unfortunately, unless you know somebody who works in there, you really can't get a tour or anything in there. Really best you can get is the West Wing, which is pretty awesome too. But again, you have to know somebody with specific access. I won't go into detail, but of course for general White House tour, you have to go through your congressperson on that.
Yes, sir.
So the chandeliers were astonishing, and then they disappeared, and now they're back.
Yeah.
So were they in storage somewhere?
No, they're reconstructed from
Really?
photographs, refabricated, purpose. Yeah, just like they were in the first place, but they were lucky they could find somebody to do it. They were originally all those chandeliers were gas. Actually, I'm not sure about maybe the war wing, but by the time they finished it, they might have been using some electricity there. But yeah.
You know, you mentioned several architects, American architects that were educated in France. I was just wondering, when did the American School of Architecture come into their own?
It's a great question. I don't know if you guys heard it. It's about the evolution of American architectural training. The question was about being trained in France. The first American who goes to the French École des Beaux-Arts is Richard Morris Hunt, who I think studied there in 1857. That year just keeps coming up, like every sentence. So before that, it was more done in the United States on an apprentice kind of basis. It starts to be more professionalized by earlier than like Mills and those guys who were building the Treasury. That it becomes kind of an apprenticed profession, and it works that way. The American schools are established on the model of the French, but they don't really come into existence until the very late 19th century, 1890s, and into the 20th century. Yeah.
The question is in terms of the financing and what the standard is here. It seems over time it was utilitarian, and then they decided to go all the way and restore. Is that the basis for the future in terms of other buildings, or is this really the last of its kind that's going to get this kind of funding given austerity budgets?
It's a kind of a yes question. The yes part to the second part of your question is that there aren't buildings like this. So it's a kind of a one-off, which is why it took 130 years to actually get it to the point of a comprehensive restoration in the first place. It's such a big project, it took 9/11 to get the political will to blow the money on it. Now, at the same time, and I don't work for GSA, I work with them on a lot of projects in D.C., and I can't really I don't really know what they're up against. I do know that they are, like most federal agencies, they don't have the revenue or the wherewithal to do what they used to do 30 years ago. They're doing as much as they can with less. But then there's always like the project that gets like right now, all the national capital money is really tied up with redoing the St. Elizabeth's campus for the new Department of Homeland Security's headquarters. But they're not probably pouring much into the Department of Labor. So it's not like it was in the 60s. We're not building huge bureaucracy buildings. It's not the model. I don't know if that answers your question, but this is a pretty unique thing that won't happen.
So there's no set protocol in terms of restoring buildings to a certain level. It's haphazard in terms of case by case.
Of course, it's probably too complicated to say. I don't because I don't work on that side of it. But let me put it this way: they all have projects. They have to make priorities, and they get funding, and But what I can probably say is they don't have as much funding as they would like to do everything that they would want to do. So, yeah.
So, with restoration projects, obviously you have to bring in people who have very specialized skills. Do you think, as someone as young as me, it's harder to find somebody in my generation who's got that skill set, for restoration projects, or do you think it's something that with some effort can be passed on?
I think that there are lots of opportunities for people to be trained and educated in the trades or the research, whatever it is, whether it's the abstract scholarly side all the way down to the trade side and anything in between. There's lots of people who are interested in being developed all the time.
Yeah, because one time my dad, my family owns a building in Rochester, New York that has the actual antique bricks that they would actually build in a kiln, and now it's next to impossible to find someone who's really specialized in it.
Depends on your market too. DC's a great market for historic work because there's a lot of it, and there's more money here to throw at it. But in a smaller market like Rochester, it might be harder to find local sources. One last question in the back. Yeah.
Hi, you spoke about the wherewithal and the revenue it would take to do something like that. What about the craftsmanship? When I look at some of these old buildings in Washington D.C., I'm amazed, and I think, where would you find people who do this?
So, related to the question that was just asked, is it possible to find it? There are people who do it. They're harder to find, but they exist, and part of it is how you write the contracts. Again, I'm more on the planning and design side than I am on the construction, and so I don't know. I wish I could give you more. Like, all you have to do is this, and this. I don't know. But I know it can be done because I've seen the results in this project. There are definitely contractors and craftsmen who can do the work. You got to pay for it. The quick question, the last question. How big is the building? It's just, in gross square feet, it's just under 700,000 square feet on 7 levels, and it's got about 1,000 columns. I just remember these little.
Order the size of the Pentagon?
Since I can't remember the size of the Pentagon, it sounds about right. 2.5 million. Is that right? I don't know. Anyway, pleasure.
Yes. Yeah. Tom will be signing. I'm Kim Stipek. We're so thrilled to be partnering with the Historic Society of Washington, and we're so appreciative of the turnout. It's so encouraging. And please, the part of the proceeds of Tom's books that he'll be signing over at the Register go to the HSW. So I know you're all here to support them and want to have a souvenir tonight. Thank you, and stay tuned. We're not sure when the next event will be. We're working on it. Watch our website, their website. Thank you for coming.